I'm glad it's sunny today. Yesterday, we had movers come to our house. Thank you, Ross, for the recommendation. Who took our furniture from our upstairs, our main floor, and put it in the garage and some in the basement. And then some we built a tent on the patio and covered up over there. And I'm not really a great Boy Scout, and so the tent I made for this furniture, I kept praying was going to stay dry underneath. We'll see in about 10 days when our upstairs floor and painting project is done. It was, though, as I watched the movers take all this furniture and distribute it to other locations, very disorienting for me. I don't know if you've ever lived in a house for quite a while. Kirsten and I have lived in ours now for about 7 years. It's a very disorienting feeling when all of a sudden things that had been so in place and so rooted that you could walk around your house, blindfolded and know exactly where. Very disorienting when that's all gone. And there's just this barrenness and this emptiness. And I kept wandering around last night, wondering, where is it? And why do I feel so unsettled? If you've ever moved, you know something about being disoriented. Of course, there are other types of disorientation that greet us in our lives. It can be the death of a loved one that turns everything upside down and makes things seem barren or empty. It can be the loss of a job and the loss of health. Changes just in the neighborhood that you had grown up in or lived in a long, long time. There's all sorts of reasons for disorientation to pop into our lives. I think we've been experiencing that as a nation, a sense of disorientation, and it's been growing slowly but surely now for a couple decades at least. A kind of upheaval in all sorts of realms of our public life, upheaval in politics, upheaval in racial equality, upheaval in gender issues, upheaval economically. I mean, we all have experienced as a nation a sort of disorientation that has left many folks, many of us, sort of wondering, where's it all going and why did it leave where it once was? The hard thing, though, about disorientation is it can lead to fear. Especially fear of the other. Fear of the one who is not like me. I mean, we've been there. We've all been there. Where we bump into someone who is physically or they present very different from us, and our first instinct, I mean, we don't even think about it, is to recoil, to draw back, to preserve ourselves, and to disengage. Disorientation leads to fear of the other. And fear, when we're afraid in our hearts and in our guts, fear leads to anger. Anger. This thing that we feel that just makes our shoulders crunch forward and tightens our breathing and our stomach and makes us want to lash out at whatever is around us for whatever reason. Disorientation, fear, anger. And all of that covers over like soil that covers over a casket being laid into the ground. Disorientation, fear, anger covers over grief. That heartfelt sense of loss. You know, we are a grieving nation. Grieving for a time that is no longer present with us. And it's kind of gotten covered over. And the one thing about grief, when it gets buried in the ground, like some weird zombie movie, it finds a way to surface and come at us. And then we start the cycle over again. We become afraid and angry. And we just keep taking it out on each other. Think about just in church over the decades, how much has changed, or in Auburn around us, how much has changed. If we bury that over, we can grow angry, and the grief we have that what we have is not like it once was, that grief will surface and it will come after us. And it will cause us to do things that in our better self we would rather not do. That human trajectory, disorientation to fear, to anger, to grief. Psalm 54 that I read captures it perfectly. Now, it's a deliverance psalm. It's a call to be saved. Defend my cause. Hear my prayer, the psalmist yells out to God. Why? Because there is conflict about. Conflict that the reading from James also speaks about. But here in the psalm, hear my prayer, O God, defend my cause. Strangers have risen up against me. The ruthless have sought my life. And then in the midst of this disorientation, there's this beautiful statement of faith. God is my helper. Lift me up, rescue me, the psalmist says. But you know what? You know what? The psalmist is all too human. The psalmist is all too human and says, God, as you lift me up and rescue me, do so that I can look down on my enemy. Destroy that other person, oh God. Even the psalmist gets caught up in this human trajectory of disorientation, fear and anger and grief. Yes, the psalmist is someone who has been beaten down, someone who may have experienced a really severe threat in their life, someone who might have felt exposed and vulnerable, someone who just can't do it on their own anymore, and they're angry, and they want the other destroyed. Now that is quite a normal feeling. And I'm glad that the psalmist directed it to God. Because one of the beautiful things about God, when we go to God with our fears and our anger, the beautiful thing about God is when we say, God, destroy that enemy of mine, God calls time out and asks us to breathe and reminds us that God loves us and that maybe violence and vengeance is not the best way for humans to live together. There are other responses other than anger and grief to disorientation and fear. And I heard one on the radio the other day. I was driving from an appointment back to my house, and in the midst of our climate, I began to realize that there's this really weird other way of responding to what's going on around us. And this came from a wonderful false prophet on the radio. And I name him a false prophet because initially I was really interested. I don't often turn on the religious station when I'm driving around in the car, but I did, and this amazing preacher was talking about the good news of Jesus. I thought, ooh, I could use some good news today. But the more I listened, the more I thought, oh, this is not good news. This is truly a false prophet in our midst. This preacher who talked about the good news of Jesus, I began to sense that really good news only applied to certain people, and it only applied after you left this earth, when you go to heaven. Now, I have nothing against heaven. I'm looking forward to it one day. But only to certain people. And it really had nothing to do with our situation now, right here and now. The preacher said things like, Jesus takes us away from our anger against our neighbor. Jesus takes us away from the divisions in our schools and in our neighborhoods. Jesus takes us away from the suffering of the pandemic. Jesus takes us away from any social issue that might be on your heart, whether it be poverty or homelessness. And he made a whole list. And then it really got me when he said, all those tents you see under overpasses will be gone because Jesus will take us home and we won't have to see him anymore. And he said, well, maybe Jesus might take some homeless people. He said, but not many, because they're paying for their sins. False prophets in our midst. And it wasn't just that he was down on certain people, but the impact on the rest of us was just as strong. Because if the goal of this whole following Jesus thing is to be taken home someday somewhere else, it takes away responsibility from us for here. If it's all about going somewhere else, who cares about the neighbor or the earth or the economy or race? Who cares about those things? They won't be in heaven where I'll be at. He was giving us an excuse for our worst behavior. I can cheat my neighbor because I'm going to go to heaven. That's Jesus' good news for me. I don't need to care about what's going on in the environment because Jesus is going to take me away from here. Let the people who are left suffer. When you live in times of disorientation, fear and anger and grief, you get all sorts of responses. Either Jesus is going to take us away, or we can just be stuck here and get violent with one another. Is that really God's way? Is that really what God is calling us to? Think about the gospel reading. Jesus is traveling, he's teaching, he's walking about with his disciples in Galilee. And in the midst of that walk that he's having, as they're on the way, Jesus says to his disciples, hey, I'm going to be betrayed, I'm going to be killed, and after 3 days, I'm going to rise again. And he calls himself the Son of Man. Now, in Mark's gospel, the Son of Man has a very special meaning. The Son of Man in Mark's gospel is the one who is representative of all of us. The one who is there, front and center, and who represents all of us to God and to one another. Think about it this way. Anyone who commits themselves to God's way, to God's kingdom, to God's will, anyone who commits themselves to God's way will suffer just like the Son of Man will suffer. He shows us what is going to happen when we cleave to what God desires instead of setting our mind on human things. Remember that just from last week? Jesus said, set your mind not on human things, set your mind on divine things. Have you ever had a time in your life when you have committed yourself to something you really believed in and you suffered because of it? I think most of us have. Whether it was a stand we took at work or in our families or in our communities, whether we acknowledged it as a God stand or just out of personal conviction, you know that when you take a stand, you suffer. When was that last time that happened for you? Well, Jesus and his disciples stopped to rest in Capernaum. They were in a house. And Jesus, as his wont, had overheard something when they were walking together, and he waited till they gathered probably for supper and were hanging out in the house. And he said, what were y'all arguing about? And they were ashamed. They're silent. For on the way they had argued what, folks? Shout it out. What'd they argue? Who was the greatest among them? And so he decides to once again teach them about what it means to be on God's way, in his presence. Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all. And we shorten it up to what? Say it with me. Whoever wants to be first must be last, must be servant. You remember what comes next right after he teaches them this? What's he do? Someone shout it out. Yes, but not here. What? I'm like behind this Star Trek plexiglass, so I can't hear all. What? Someone shouted it out, I think. What? He took what? He took a little child and he put it in their midst. And I got to tell you that as much as we love children, in the ancient world, children had the lowest social status in society. There was a hierarchy of status in the ancient world, and angels were up here, and then men, and then women were below them, and then below women were children, and below children were dogs, and below children, or below the dogs, were rocks. So I guess you could say that children at least were higher than dogs and rocks, but among the neighborhood, they were the lowest. And the word here is little child, the lowest of the lowly. Jesus takes and puts in their midst. And he says to them, do not focus on being the greatest or associating with the greatest. Rather, gather in a community of the least and the lowest, as society defines it. And when you do that, God's way is among you. God's way is among you. Now, if we were to take that seriously as a faith community, how's that going to shape who we are as Messiah Lutheran? How's it change our values, what we lean into and uphold? How's it change our programming or our actions as a church community? If we do this, I tell you, if we commit to God's way, we may suffer, just as Jesus suffered because of it. And that's the last thing we want to hear about now in the midst of a global pandemic is, oh my gosh, Chuck, Jesus is saying we got to suffer more? That's not quite what I said. I said we may suffer. I want to tell you about a congregation I visited during seminary. They were talking about hosting a tent city for homeless folk. It was a tent city that traveled to different churches, and each church hosted it for 2 months, and then it traveled to a new one and traveled to a new one, and it was quite a well-oiled machine of community that was run mostly by the folk who lived in it. It was pretty amazing, and so this congregation I visited was having a conversation about whether they should get in the rotation. Now, when I went to their congregational community meeting, there were two types of folks there, basically. There were folks who, mostly a lot of preschool families, a lot of folks who were afraid and were speaking out of some stereotypes about homeless folks. You could tell they were afraid for their kids, for their neighborhood, for their church. On the other hand, the folks on the other side of the fence, you could say, if the pews in that church were like blue pews and red pews, these are the blue pew folks. They were the ones who said, oh, it's going to be easy. There aren't going to be any problems. Everything's taken care of. There's a system in place. We won't have any issues. They were kind of just a little disconnected from the reality of doing an important but actually pretty involved program. And as an observer, you could tell a lot of hard feelings and suffering going on there in between. A couple weeks later, representatives of both groups, and I was part of that, went to visit the tent city where it was. And as I went, I marveled at the ingenuity of it. But then as both of these red and blue pew camps from that church started talking to one another about their experience of visiting the tent city, all of a sudden, both these groups, out of that shared experience, started to come together and actually have an honest conversation with one another. That polarization at their first meeting had dissipated quite a bit, and they decided to move forward with some pretty strict guidelines that everyone felt good about until the neighbors around the church started calling. And then the whole cycle started again. Hard feelings, more suffering. I don't know whatever happened, if they ever hosted the tent city. But one thing they did learn was that then they were called to hard things. They had a shared experience that allowed them to overcome their polarity and begin to actually talk with one another. In many ways, I talked about this last time. It was what 9/11 was like for us as a nation. But we have forgotten those lessons. Jesus says the shared experience we get, his gift to us, is to walk with him along the way. That's what we all are called to, is to walk with Jesus together along the way of faith, along the path of service. And as we do that, the polarities, the polarization that we experience in our larger society, at least we have the ability to overcome it and begin to talk with one another honestly and begin to decide how to be a community of faith together. The example of this right now for Messiah is our call committee. I've been able to sit in on some of their meetings and listen to their deliberations, and they are wrestling with some tough stuff at this point about what has been the gift of Messiah's Faith and Family ministry program, about what are the challenges before it, and how our city has changed, and how are we going to reach out and connect with the youth and families in faith around us. Those are deep, deep questions, and they're wrestling together with them. And the beautiful thing is they know the gift of being on the way together with Jesus. And in the midst of their disagreements and different points of view, they have not become polarized. They have become a deeper community with one another. Being able to be different together for a common cause. That's the gift that Jesus brings to us. The gift that he gives to us when he sets the child in our midst and says, have an experience with the least and the lowliest. And as you have that experience as God's people, you will be transformed into a new community. Maybe one that doesn't have all the answers, but one that continues to walk along the way together. Which is really a foretaste. A community walking along the way together. It's a foretaste of the feast to come. Or if I was to ever meet the preacher on the radio, I'll say, dude, you skipped the appetizers and went right to the main course. Come on back. Let's have a beer and some appetizers before we go there. And as we do, we'll make something new here. Something godly here in our midst. Amen.